So we hear today the hopefully familiar story, parable of the lost son, sometimes called the prodigal son. And sometimes when we hear this familiar parable, perhaps we do or do not relate to the prodigal son. But I find myself that sometimes, at least when I initially hear it, I often relate to the prodigal son insofar as I think I'm already back home, that I've already made it. But sometimes we have to take a step back and realize maybe we're not all the way there yet. Or that maybe we're like that older brother who doesn't realize what he has, all that God wants to share with him. And that it's easy for us to look as the prodigal son as someone else, that other guy who lived a crazy life and I guess is making their way back home, that sinner. About a century ago, there was an article that was written in an English newspaper in England. And the article asked the question, what is wrong with the world? And it asked readers to submit answers of what their take on the world was. What is wrong with the world? So, of course, people submitted this, that, and the other thing, saying, this politician or this political idea, that's what's wrong with the world. Or they point to this or that cause in the world, or something bad that someone was doing. That's what's wrong with the world. But the shortest answer was surprisingly submitted by a Catholic writer named G.K. Chesterton, who had a reputation for being quite long-winded and verbose in most of his answers, and witty. But instead, here's what was submitted by him. He simply wrote, "Dear Sir, regarding your article of what's wrong with the world, the answer, I am. Yours truly, G.K. Chesterton." We live in a broken and fallen world. And there are bad things that are going on in the world, and there's plenty of things we can complain about. And there's plenty of things we can justifiably point to and say that's wrong with the world. And there's plenty of things we can look at and point to the world that are bad and that do need to be corrected. But sometimes in doing that, we sometimes forget to look at ourselves and the way that we're the ones contributing to the brokenness and sin and fallenness of the world. The ways that we're contributing to the problems of the world. To say, what's wrong with the world? I am. There's a popular psychologist named Dr. Jordan P. Peterson from Canada, who's become a YouTube sensation and has gathered quite the following. And one of his things that he talks about, and he wrote a book on, is the 12 rules of life for people to follow. And 12 rules of how to live a better life. And one of the rules, rule number 6, is he says, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything good for the world until we become perfect. That's not what he means by it. But this idea that our ambition to change the world should always be bound by our humility. To recognize that we don't know it all and that we're not perfect. And that one of our steps in correcting the world is working on ourselves. That we have to have the humility to keep looking here. To look at the problem of the world here as well as out there. So what's wrong with the world? I am. Or put in another way, when I was in seminary, our vice rector, he was a large, jolly Italian man. We sometimes called him the Papa Familia of the seminary. And that one day, of course, being in an intentional environment like that, little petty things tend to build up and blow up in a fishbowl. That small things can become great dramatic things. And so seminarians also have a tendency to complain about such things because they have strong opinions of how things should be done. And so one day he gave us an address to the whole seminary, and he finally said, the core message, we can complain about all these things, but, hey pal, maybe the problem is you. What's wrong with the world? And we also, in looking at the church, I know as a young clergy of the church, have been looking at the news and seeing all the bad things that other leaders of the church have been doing or bad decisions they've been making. The lack of holiness among some of our clergy in the church. It's easy for me to point to them and say, that's what's wrong with the church, that we need more holy clergy. Then all of a sudden I find myself looking in the mirror and seeing a pretty unholy clergyman. That in praying about this, the conviction of realizing what's my response to the scandal of the church, I need to get a lot more holy. Now, what's wrong with the church? I am. To have the humility to realize that what the church needs and what the world needs is the radical pursuit of holiness. So that, I think in identifying with the prodigal son, that sometimes there's moments when we need to come to our senses, as it says in the gospel, and look in the ways that we're still sitting in the pig slop. And to realize that what we need to do and what the world needs more than anything else is for us to come to our senses, to get up, and to run back to God the Father. To run back to the Father with the confidence of knowing that He is compassionately searching for us and yearning to pour out His mercy and His love upon us. That the greatest tragedy in the world, in fact the only tragedy, is that we do not become saints. It's what the world needs more than anything else. What the church needs are saints. For you and me to become saints. And the saints weren't the people who were necessarily perfect the whole time, but they were the ones who had a moment where they came to the senses and realized the pig slop that they were sitting in, and knew that the only thing they could do and the best thing they could do for the world was to get up and to run to God the Father. To say, I am not perfect, that I'm what's wrong with the world. And what I need is His grace and mercy. And that the best thing I can do for the world is to run to Him, to search for Him. That's what the world needs. For us to be saints, the radical pursuit of holiness, to stand up and to run to Him, the only one who can fix the world, who can save the world by His love and His mercy.